Hello, I'm Carol Carman and I'd like to welcome you to number 11 in a series of occasional podcasts from Grunty Fennery, home of all things Dennis of Grunty Fen. Our website is all the W's, dennisofgruntyfen.co.uk. In this podcast, Mr. South is in conversation with someone who was there at the very creation of Dennis, and that's Liz Sayers, who was married to Pete Sayers at the time. Mr. South spoke to Liz at his home, which accounts for some of the creaky noises you can hear, and they're coming from his interviewing chair rather than the man himself. Liz starts by telling him how Dennis came about.
Dennis of Grunty Fen wasn't Dennis of Grunty Fen originally, he was just Dennis. And he was born one Sunday morning in the summer of 1974. We got married in April 1974, and Pete moved into the cottage I rented in Dullingham, and we were waiting for the Sunday papers in bed in the days when you had papers delivered, and Pete had recorded on the same label as the singing postman, Alan Smethurst, with sticky out top teeth glasses. That's the one. And he'd had a set of top teeth made just like Alan Smethurst's, and he dressed up to entertain me with the teeth, the glasses, a cap and a black plastic Mac. I cannot for the life of me remember what he was doing, but it was very, very funny. And we had the most wonderful neighbour called George Drain and his wife Rose, and they lived in the cottage directly behind ours, and George used to help me in the garden. That sort of was wonderful.
You're known as Drainy.
Drainy, yeah. So I said...
It's not a very flattering thing. Anyway, carry on.
Well, I said, this is so funny, you've got to do him on Drainy. So he agreed to do him on Drainy. And Drainy was in the garden. I introduced Pete. I said, this is Dennis, Pete's brother from Ipswich, who's visiting us. And Drainy said, oh, very pleased to meet you. How'd you get here? And Dennis said, I cycled. And that's perfectly reasonable because Drainy had been brought up in near Fulham Market. He cycled round East Anglia demolishing windmills in his youth in the 1920s. So cycling from Ipswich was no big deal, despite the fact that this was about 10 o'clock in the morning. But never mind, he'd obviously started out very early. Yes. And this went on for about 10 minutes or so. And I could see Drainy wasn't really buying this at all. He'd sussed it.
Oh, had he?
He'd sussed it. So he winked at me and said, I think I'd better take you in to meet Mother. So we went in and met Mrs. Drain, Rose.
Which I told you, but had Drainy sussed it to the extent of knowing it was really Pete?
He didn't say so, but it was unspoken.
Right.
And Pete, Dennis, realised that Drainy had realised.
Wow.
And
but he kept up.
He kept up the pretence, so there was no break in the conversation, as it were.
And how did Mother take it?
Fell for it, hook, line and sinker for about, I should think, getting on for 3/4 of an hour. She was in the middle of getting some lunch and she carried on talking.
What sort of things were Pete and she talking about?
Oh, what she was cooking, what he liked to eat, what he grew in his garden. She said she ought to introduce him to her son, so she introduced him to Billy, their son, and this went on and on. In the end, Pete couldn't keep it up any longer and took the cap off, the teeth out, the glasses off, and she just broke down in hysterics. And spent the rest of the afternoon just laughing. You could hear gales of laughter every 20 minutes, and she kept reliving this, that she'd been completely taken in.
And at which point did one of you, Pete or you, realise that there was more to this than...
Then, I think. Immediately. It was just so believable and so funny. Pete wasn't quite sure. He thought he would try, give Dennis a try. We were, at the time, Pete, when he came back from America, he was the first Englishman to work regularly on the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee, and he had a television program on a morning television programme in Nashville. But he made a decision to come back to...
What sort of age was Pete at that time?
When he was in America.
Yeah.
Or he was in his very early 20s.
Right. So he was in sort of late 20s when he came back, was he?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I said, you've got to do him on the Opry, which was the country music show that he ran at the old Kingsway Cinema in Newmarket on the last Sunday of every month. This would be just an ideal place to try out to see if there was, I suppose, life in this character.
This fantasy character.
Yes. And so I got him an old raincoat because the black plastic mat looked a bit seedy, to be honest. So
the Mackie wall wasn't much less seedy, but still, carry on.
Well, it was a colleague of mine's cleaning the car.
Do you know, I still possess that Mac.
And
it
still
stinks.
I know.
It's horrible.
That's why people didn't like getting too close to Dennis.
It's covered in irrelevant badges.
Yes.
From Butlins from the 1950s and that sort of thing.
He collected those over the years. He didn't have those to begin with, obviously, but...
But how did he go down at the Grand Ole Opry?
Well, first of all, he did a recce. He walked down Newmarket High Street and nobody took any notice of him. And he went to the Newmarket Journal office and filled in a wedding report for his brother. And the receptionist, Terry, who'd been there a long, long time, Terry knew Pete very well, but obviously she'd never come across Dennis. And she gave him the form and worked through the questions with him and got to the question about description of the dress. And Dennis said that were a white one. And he couldn't carry on. He just broke up and had to own up. And I don't think...
Do you know, time and time again, you say Pete corpsed.
Yes.
Because he made himself laugh so much.
Yes.
I mean, I spent hours and hours with him concocting Dennis episodes. And sometimes, I know you shouldn't laugh at your own jokes, but we used to.
Yes.
And sometimes we laughed so much sitting in our kitchen writing a script in the mornings that I came away with painful stomach muscles because I'd really hurt myself laughing so much. But it was the best injury I ever had in my life. Anyway, okay, so he tried Dennis out by taking a wedding report to the local paper.
Yeah. So he knew that nobody would turn around and think, oh, this is a rather strange-looking old boy.
And let's face it, there are some pretty straightforward sort of people in Ely and Newmarket, straight off the Fen, aren't there, you know?
And the first time he did him on stage was at the Grand Ole Opry in Newmarket. And I've never seen people rolling in the aisles, but they did that night. Did
they know who Dennis was? They didn't.
Oh no. I mean, he wouldn't come out of. He would never come out of character. Obviously, over the years, people did. They got to know who he was, but he would never own up. And
I mean, I had terrible trouble with him and his refusal to come out of character. The most difficult one was, I will let you get back to your narrative in a moment, but we went to the East of England show. I was doing an outside broadcast. I had a live microphone. Dennis was going round with me.
Yes.
And this was the time of peak concern over attacks on the hunt. You know, blood sports was, and there were all sorts of people who were trying to sabotage the hunts. And the hunts had got together and put on a show, and it was so heavily policed. They had a heavy mob sort of standing all the way around, and a live microphone. Mr. South and Pete walked in, or Dennis walked in, and he was immediately pounced on by these security people who tried to move him out. And I was trying to do a radio show, and I needed him, and they were trying to move him out, and I was trying to, out of the corner of my mouth, to say to the security men that wouldn't be picked up with a microphone, it's an act. actor. It's an actor. And in the end, they cottoned on. But never for one moment did he stop being Dennis.
No.
He didn't do anything to help me at all. Once he was Dennis,
Yes.
full stop.
Yes. I think he got manhandled once at the Cambridge Folk Festival because he'd done Main Stage 2, and that was planned, but it had gone so well, he walked across to Main Stage 1, head down, nobody could stop him, and Arlo Guthrie had been the top of the bill on that Sunday night, and the crowd had gone mad, and they were shouting, Arlo, Arlo, Arlo. They wouldn't let him go, or they wanted him to do more, and he wasn't going to do any more because the show had to finish on the dot on that Sunday night, and Richard Digance was supposed to follow Arlo Guthrie, and the whole thing was going to wrap up. Richard Digance couldn't get on stage because the audience just was so rowdy, they just wouldn't calm down. Dennis clambered onto the stage, and the security guys were trying to stop him. He had bruises on his arms the next morning because they really manhandled him to try and get him off, but he wasn't having it. And he got on stage. He did about 20 minutes of Dennis. The audience thought that this was a real local yokel.
Right, yes.
Just the real McCoy. Wow, we've really got a real folk person.
Yes.
And Richard Digance was so grateful. He said, I would never have been able to do my set if it hadn't been for Dennis calming the audience down. And
really?
And they gave him a hell of a reception at the end because he
when Dennis came on unbidden, unofficially, what did he actually do? I don't know what instrument he had. I think he probably had It was songs rather than dialogue.
He sang. I think he went. He got a banjo probably, and started playing that just to.
Mr. South always used to call it. I see you brought your banjo.
Well, I think he probably had one of those, and that calmed everybody down a little bit. And then you're right then.
Yeah.
And then that sounds, and the way he had of looking at an audience, he just almost could control them and make them quiet. Well, we better listen. And then he went into whatever he did then. I think I was more worried about him having been manhandled by the security guys.
Pete often told me in later years, on this business of his ability to manage an audience, that the one sort of audience that always escaped him was occasionally he had to, for money, he had to go to corporate events and entertain executives and their wives. And I can remember him almost crying some mornings. He'd come back from that sort of gig, saying it was awful because they were all so conscious of one another and their own internal pecking order that nobody wanted to laugh first in case to laugh was inappropriate or wrong, So he says he couldn't get any response out of them because they were all terrified to show they were happy.
Well, the trick was always to work with the chief exec or the chairman or whoever was the top dog, and then they laughed, and then
it was released it,
and or you set up somebody who was either willing to be set up, which could be the chief exec or the chairman, or somebody was willing to act as the sort of fall guy.
But he was very observant because on one occasion he and I were engaged to do a double act at the old fire engine house in Ely, where the very top executives of Tesco were having a lunch. There were only about
half a dozen of
them, or maybe 10.
Yes.
And he looked at them. He wasn't getting anywhere with them, but he noticed that the more exalted the executive was, the wider apart the stripes on his suit were. And it does work, this. The more modest executive has quite close together stripes. And if you look at the average bookmaker, the same thing is true. The more prosperous or loud they are, then the wider apart. And he played on this, and it was so true that they were forced to laugh at their own predicament. Liz, you've said, and we both know, that as Dennis, Pete would never come out of character. And he used to go around all sorts of country shows and so on. And sometimes your children, Goldie and John, were there right with their father, being a clod-hopping... I mean, there they were, both at public school, for pity's sake, and nicely spoken children. And there they were, the children of this dreadful man who was going around. I mean, how did they take it all? Well, they must have been mortified.
I think because we referred to Dennis as Dennis, he existed as a separate entity as far as they were concerned. And that's what Dad did.
But they went right up to him. I can remember at the choir show, they went right up to him when he was...
Well, they did that because they knew he wouldn't come out of the character. And if they wanted ice cream, and I said they'd already had an ice cream and they couldn't have another one, maybe, they knew that he'd give them money
just to get rid of them.
So they said, Dad, can I have that? And he'd just give them money for ice cream to go and get rid of them, so that he didn't have to come out of character, because people were always wanting him to come out of character, and he wouldn't. And then eventually people would give up and go away and either think, I think a lot of people thought he was real. They didn't realise that he wasn't.
What amazed me! I'm amazed that nobody ever hit him or slapped his face, because he was terribly rude to people. Once he was Dennis, I can remember he used to go up to women who'd done their best, country ladies who'd done their best to look smart, and he'd walk up to them and say, "Who did your hair then? The council?" Just terrible. And they laughed. Yes. They laughed.
Yes,
he could get away with anything.
I think he also did, as part of his one-man show, as well as Dennis, he would do LaWanda Davis, who was a country music singer, a rock and roller, and a vicar. But the rock and roller, I remember one night he came back, I don't know what he'd been doing, but the children were having a bath, and he came in as this rock and roller, and they were Goldie, my daughter, cry because
she's frightened.
She was quite frightened. She'd never seen it before, and she was quite frightened of she was quite little at the time, and she was quite upset by the sight of this rock and roller. I think the occasion when he was forced to, I was going to say, take his own clothes off. We went to a showbiz dinner at the Grosvenor House Hotel on Park Lane, and everyone had said, it's going to be a bit dull. Why don't you bring Dennis? So he brought Dennis, and he thought he'd see how it was going. And it had been a little bit on the dull side. So he went out, got changed into Dennis, came in, and then went round getting everybody's autograph. Mr. Wogan, I'm a real fan of yours, and all that sort of thing. And a friend of ours, John D. Loudermilk, who's a songwriter, was staying with us. And Dennis went up to him and did his bit. And John D. said to one of the security, waiter or something, "This man is pestering me. I don't know who he is. Get rid of him." So they chucked him out, and he had to... was chucked out and had to take all his Dennis gear off in
but as he was being chucked out, I bet he didn't break cover, did he?
Oh, no, not till he realised that he was going to be evicted and he needed to get back in, so he had to own up. And
can we go back to Newmarket High Street?
Yes.
Because in the narrative of the birth of Dennis, you've got us into the occasion when he placed a wedding report in the paper. Now, I have a recollection of when he and I first met, when I was doing an outside broadcast at the Memorial Hall. Were you there?
I remember the outside.
Were you? I'm a bit hazy on what happened. I can remember. Well, you tell me your version of it then. This is the first time Mr. South and Dennis met at an outside broadcast. It was an antiques something. And I was working very hard trying to make it more interesting than it really was with a live microphone one morning on Radio Cambridgeshire. What happened?
Very difficult to do an antique show on radio.
Yes.
For a start. You were working with Steve Summers, who was a presenter on Radio Cambridgeshire at the time, and Steve played guitar in Pete's band.
Right.
So they worked together for a long time. And this program was going out over a lunchtime. I'd come home for lunch, I think, and Pete had got the radio on. I guess he knew Steve was perhaps doing this. And it was dire, really dire.
It was a dull program.
I do apologise. It was very dull. It really wasn't working.
It's very difficult to make antiques good on radio.
I said, you really ought to just take Dennis down there and rescue it. So he went up, changed into Dennis, went down to his shed where he kept all his bicycle bits and pieces, and took a sack of bicycle saddles and gear bits and bobs, and pitched up at the Memorial Hall with all this stuff. And the rest is history.
Well, it's not completely, because I can remember I was interviewing anybody I could lay hands on, and this dreadful smelly man came and sat beside me.
That must have been an experience.
It was, and I had no idea, and he was sort of trying to make himself interesting, trying to hog the microphone.
Of course.
And he wanted to talk about what he'd got in this sack.
Yeah, Sturmey Archer gears.
Yes, about which I knew nothing. But, I mean, in my position, I'll interview anybody about anything. So I started to interview him, and he gave me some pretty wonky answers. Everything I asked, he responded to. He very much sounded as if he just crawled out of the fen. And I just began to wonder if this guy I was talking to was all really, there was something wrong. Were you listening? Yeah. But I can't remember what happened when I was quite convinced that I was talking to somebody who was pretending to be somebody else. How did I can't remember. I know I carried on, but I didn't say you're a fake, did I?
No, I honestly, to be honest, I don't remember the broadcast, because I think
lucky you.
Having set this up, I think I'd gone back to edit the Newmarket Journal. I had to get back to it. So I think I can remember Pete coming back and saying it had gone really well, and you'd fallen for it hook, line, and sinker.
No, I didn't. That's not true.
You would say you sussed it from the beginning.
No. It took me less than a minute to suss it.
Yeah.
But the reason I now think, in self-defence, that I kept going was that it was so much better than anything else we'd done on that programme, that I kept it going. Yeah. And it would cease to be funny if I said, you're only pretending.
Yes, exactly.
So I just kept it going.
Yes. And then I don't remember what happened after that. I don't remember this must have been in the mid-1980s, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about it.
I mean, Pete had been doing Dennis. He toured, doing combined services, entertaining the troops in Bahrain.
Well, I'd never heard of him. Never heard of Dennis. I hardly heard of Pete Sayers, to be honest. No, Pete and I got along wonderfully well, but his music and my music were always far apart. I don't know why we liked one another as much as we did, except that we had the same sense of humour.
Well, and he always thought you were educated beyond your own intelligence.
That's right, yes. The trouble is, you, Miss South, you're educated beyond your intelligence.
Yes, and he'd then give you he used to do this sort of look. He'd look you up and down. And you thought you were being... he'd somehow seen...
Yes, sir, he'd seen through you, and he was shrinking
completely.
But I don't know how long after that Memorial Hall encounter at Newmarket, but for some reason he was at the Radio Cambridgeshire building, which was then near the War Memorial in Cambridge. And he was in the corridor, and he stopped me, and I didn't recognise him. Because he was sometimes very smartly dressed, wasn't he? Beautiful sports jacket. He even wore a little trilby sometimes. It made him look like a tipster or something.
Arthur Shepherd.
Arthur Shepherd.
A long fond memory. It's closed down now.
Well, anyway, so he stopped me in the corridor and he must have reminded me of how we first met when he was pretending to be Dennis. And that must have been only 2 or 3 weeks before. And he must have been mulling it over in his mind. And he said that he thought that Dennis was perfect for radio because it allowed the listeners to conjure up the whole scene. Pete was brilliant at understanding things like that. That he knew what we all know, that the pictures on radio are better than the pictures on television. It's not a joke, it's true. And he wanted to try Dennis out on the radio. Now, but what happened next is inconceivable in today's BBC. It wouldn't happen now. I took the idea upstairs, and a fortnight later or less, we were on air doing it. It was quite easy to sell the idea. Nowadays, because the BBC is so cautious, it would take, I don't know, months.
I should imagine someone would want to see copies of scripts.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I can understand why. But there was a rather more sort of piratical, buccaneering, give it a try atmosphere, which produced some pretty good results and some terrible failures as well. Anyway, so there we were. We went on air, and we were far too cocky about our own brilliance. But each of us thought we were absolute bee's knees of comedy, So we never wrote a script.
No.
We used to just sit there and talk. Yeah. It wasn't even edited, Liz. No. So that there was. It was. I'm not going to play them to you, and I'm going to keep them quiet. But I have got some very early recordings, and they are dire. I won't say they were totally unfunny. They did have their moments, but it took us about a year to discover that we weren't as clever as we thought we were, and we weren't as funny as we thought we were. And what you needed was a bit more brain and planning in it. And we started to script them, and things changed a lot after that.
Because at the beginning, the segments were quite short. They were 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's right, 12, I think, yes.
Because I think that was in the very early days.
Yeah.
When I was doing paper reviews, I think.
Oh, you used to come in and do the newspapers on the same programme, didn't you, at the same time?
And it was sort of back to back.
Yes.
And then
I'd forgotten that.
So I only got to hear Dennis driving home in the car.
Yes.
So when I got...
But what did you think of it then? Come on, be honest.
I mean, I've always thought that Dennis was a creation of genius. You see, because I'd known him for...
But he didn't come over at first.
I don't know, 15 years or something.
But what we needed was somebody to say, that's not the way to do it. This is a good idea, but somebody needs to take it by the scruff of the neck and shake it. It took us about another 10 years before we found somebody who told us the truth. But before that, we'd sorted ourselves out. Every week was scripted.
Yes.
And we had a very crude system. Everything, I used to type it out, and everything that Dennis said was in lowercase, and everything that Mr. South said was in uppercase. So you didn't have to write him, me, all the way down. That was the way it worked.
And I think in those days, because it was recorded, and by that time I think Stuart White had moved from Radio Cambridgeshire to Ipswich, I think, and he wanted me to go with him.
Oh, dear, I didn't know that.
But it was too far for me to drive on a Sunday morning.
Because he used to present the morning programme on Saturdays.
And so I was at home, and if Dennis had been a real hit, I would cry and laugh in the same programme, and that was a real bullseye.
I can tell you an episode of Dennis, and we've been going by 6 years, I think, by then. And you said afterwards that you had laughed and cried in one episode, and it was a good episode. But Sally Field's daughter, little Hayley,
yes,
Sally Field, for people who don't know, was the mother of so many children that she wasn't sure how many. And she was married to a terrible man called...
He was a ne'er-do-well, wasn't he?
Ne'er-do-well, he was always in prison. Anyway, and little Haley was an angelic daughter who survived, somehow came through this awful family and could sing and play the piano. Yeah. And she appeared at a music festival. And there were all the posh kids doing all right. And then little Haley, who came from a wretched family, her mother used to survive by sprout picking. Do you remember Sally Field? Yeah. Haley sang... I think Dennis had to describe what happened. And he said, I looked down from up there and she was singing and they all went quiet. And Miss South, that was like there was a cloud around her. Do you remember that description of her little voice that was coming through? And lots of listeners afterwards said that when she won the prize, they cried because it was such sort of a triumph over adversity of a poor little girl.
Yes.
We used to do a bit of that sort of weepy stuff.
I think I remember at Haddenham Steam Engine Rally once, Haddenham Steam Rally, we had a conversation with one of the actors from Bread, the television programme, about the effect of pathos. It's not so much the comedy, the real sort of belly laugh that appeals. It's the pathos that means more. You've got to have both.
You have, haven't you?
Both. And to achieve that in one episode was
because I mean, if we're talking about the secrets of comedy in this instance, the whole career of Mr. South and Dennis would not have been funny if for one moment Mr. South suddenly found the whole thing amusing. Mr. South had to be earnestly endeavouring to make Dennis talk sense and to say something useful. And for 17 years, Dennis absolutely refused. Mr. South asked intelligent questions and got reliably stupid answers. And that was if ever I had sort of changed made Mr. South suddenly less serious in his endeavour, it wouldn't have been funny.
What made you invent Maudie Deeks? Because Maudie Deeks, I never really bought Maudie Deeks.
Didn't you? No. I can tell you what it was. And it's an honest but not a very honourable answer. We were trying to get Radio Suffolk to take it. So we invented a character in Suffolk.
Yeah, maybe that, yes.
And that was what it was about.
Yes.
So we didn't invent Maudie Deeks, his girlfriend, because we needed a girlfriend. It was because we could put the character in Suffolk.
Yes, because she was, the coal yard was near Stowmarket, wasn't it? So,
and she kept that coal office, Maudie Deeks, she kept that coal office so clean. Do you know, you could eat your dinner off her floor. She was a good character, but you didn't really fancy her.
I know. She didn't work.
What was wrong with Maudie Deeks? Because I loved her.
I don't know. I think it was because Dennis had never shown any inclination
in women. No.
In women at all, apart from
Granny.
Do
you remember? It was very vulgar, but they used to go out in tandem, tandem, but she always rode up the front and he was behind. So he was always stuck behind Maudie Deeks. She had an ass like an Argentine heifer. She just stuck behind it.
And Ma Jeffries.
Now, Ma Jeffries, I think I may have introduced Ma Jeffries, but she was so true to English village life at that time. Yes. The bossy, striving, false posh woman that you do sometimes get in villages even now.
Yes.
Oh, we both hated Ma Jeffries.
Yes.
The pretentious Ma Jeffries, who had a little dog called Cherie. Do you remember? And on one occasion, how did it happen? Dennis sometimes did odd jobs for Ma Jeffries. And on one occasion, the dog was in Ma Jeffries' beautiful living room, and its tail got covered in paint, and it wagged its tail and put paint all around everything.
And Kylie and Jason, the twins, I remember quite a lot of discussion about their names. And that dates you.
Oh, God, my goodness, now you've got me there.
And the Reverend Stupid Partridge.
Oh, the Reverend Quentin Stupid Partridge. Get his name right.
Well, I felt sorry for Quentin Stupid Partridge.
He was trying so hard.
I do remember that a former Bishop of Huntingdon told Dennis, or it might have been Pete, but said Dennis had done more for Christianity than he ever had, because so much work always went into the Christmas episode.
Yeah, we do. The Christmas thing. There's yards of Christmas specials.
Huge compliment. And Tom Sharp used to call him the universal peasant.
Did Tom Sharp say that? I didn't know that. I used to know Tom Sharp reasonably well, but I didn't know he'd said that. That's wonderful. And that's what we traded on, the universal peasant. He's not uniquely Fen. He's just there. But you've got me going now, some of those characters. The character I truly loved was Miss Edwards at the post office, and her nervous sister, to whom Dennis had been affianced for about 20 years, but she would never say yes, because she said, I can never marry a man what blowed off. Do you remember? And he only blowed off because he had an internal gastric problem, because Buzz, who was the American serviceman friend of Dennis's mother, he never knew who his father was, had given Dennis some American chewing gum, and he'd swallowed it all down in a lump, and it settled in somewhere in his insides and had stayed there immovable for 20 or 30 years. And that was the cause of his unfortunate flatulence. I could never marry a man. What she said, I could never marry a man what blowed off.
I do remember very, very early on when Dennis of Grunty Fen was born and started to appear on or be heard on radio. Some friends of ours who lived in the old station house at Grunty Fen, there was one apparently.
It was in Streatham. It was the old Streatham railway station. They said the Green family.
People were driving round Grunty Fen on a Saturday, Sunday, looking for the...
and the Green family were quite mischievous, because they were always civil to these people who were looking for the railway carriage and Dennis. And they'd say, oh, you can't miss it. Just drop there, take the first right and the next right. And they'd send them round and round in a huge circle. And
we went over one Sunday. We took the children in the car and watched people driving very slowly. And so we thought, this is true. This is ridiculous.
People absolutely believed it. And some people thought I did both voices, which would have been... It's just impossible, because I always had the subsidiary role. When we were writing scripts, we did it. It took two days, two sessions, and I used to try to continue. We'd agreed a narrative, and I wrote a situation to which Dennis had to respond, and I always turned to Pete and said, "So what does Dennis say?" And he always knew what, given that situation, Dennis would say, and it was so I couldn't invent it. He was Dennis
completely. He wouldn't come out of character. I mean, he, as far as we were concerned, he existed.
Yeah,
we referred to him as a person.
Oh yes.
If we were somewhere, that Dennis would think that, or that would be good for Dennis. He was completely and utterly real. And
also, very important, Dennis was never really unkind.
No.
Dennis was always optimistic.
Yeah.
Some people might say, he was a dim clodhopper, but no. And the whole point in all those years is Dennis always won. Mr. South, the smart ass from Cambridge.
Yes. And he was very pleased about that.
Yes.
He was so delighted.
He always knocked me down and proved I was a fool. And in those last episodes, which are on a CD all of their own, the last 5 episodes, Mr. South is reduced to an absolute gibbering idiot because Dennis succeeds at doing voiceovers, which Mr. South had wanted to do all his life but had never managed to land it, and Pete succeeded.
And of course, the occasion that really touched Pete, Dennis wouldn't have been necessarily aware, I think, was when you had lunch with Stephen Hawking.
Oh, Liz, that was just astonishing. There were 2 really astonishing things in the whole Dennis career, and I think the Hawking one was most extraordinary. We got a message from Stephen Hawking's nurse, I think it was, the lady whom eventually he married. I'm not sure. I hope I've got that right. And his whole staff thought that this man, who had a brain the size of a planet, really ought to relax at lunchtime, stop thinking about the cosmos, and just join the real world. And so they thought that, why don't we ask Dennis in? They all listened to Dennis on the wireless. And so Dennis and Mr. South were invited to sit down in, it was the old mathematical building in the middle of Cambridge. We sat down there. There was Pete, me, Professor Hawking, his nurse, and a young guy who he always had a young student in tow. So there were 5 of us. And for more than an hour, we sat there, Dennis, the stupidest man in the world, entertaining the cleverest man in the world, and explaining very patiently, Dennis very patiently explained science to Stephen Hawking. And I can remember him saying, of course, you got some things right, Miss Hawking. You know about the speed of light, and there's the speed of sound. But what do you know about the speed of stink? And then he gave a whole lecture on how he had calculated how fast bad smells could move through the air, the speed of stink. And in fact, between us, we developed a whole lecture on the speed of stink. Oh, that was a happy moment. The other extraordinary one, that sticks in my mind because it's hard to believe, is that, do you remember the first Iraqi war? And we heard that an American Air Force officer, he was a lawyer, but he was a lawyer inside the American Air Force, and he was given an hour's notice that the whole lot of them were going to Iraq. And they could only take 1 rucksack with them to Iraq. And this officer packed his rucksack and included all his Dennis recordings.
I remember that.
They were cassettes in those days before CDs. And so he took all his Dennis recordings and he gave Dennis concerts in a tent in the desert in Iraq. And he played them. And people were walking past and thinking, that's funny sound. Gee, what's going on in there? And they were listening to Dennis episodes there. That was amazing, isn't it?
That was extraordinary.
It meant something about the universal peasant, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. I mean, there were people in Yorkshire, people down on the south coast, who were able somehow to tune in to Dennis. I'm not quite sure how that worked. And there were vicars who altered the times of their Sunday morning services so that people could listen.
But can I tell you, I mean, neither of us ever made much money out of Dennis. But by God, we were well rewarded. And I look back, and I don't think I've been many happier times in my life than when we were writing or recording a script, and we knew we got a bit of a winner. And sometimes the joke required timing. Pete and I used to do this routine actually, where I would say to him, what's the secret of comedy? And just before I'd got the word comedy out, he would jump in and say timing, just to prove he got it wrong. But there were 2 once where we laughed so much at our own joke that we had to record it several times before we could get the words out without breaking up. And the famous one was where we were looking at photographs of old Grunty Fen, and there was a photograph of a chapel, a Fen chapel. And I said, "Oh, chapel, what chapel's that then?" And he would say something like, "Oh, that's the chapel of extreme survival and absolute antiquity, the everlasting chapel of total, all the words were to do with lasting forever." And I'd say, "Oh, really? I haven't seen it. What happened to that?" And he'd say, "It makes me laugh now. The chapel of universal survival and absolute endurance, Mr. South. That fell down." It sets me cough off. But it took us ages to record that, because every time we just got to the point where he had to say that fell down, we were both laughing. But there was one episode, it was one of the best we ever did. It is the annual dinner of the Loyal and Ancient Order of Goats. And it was a disastrous annual dinner. It made us laugh like drains. It's the one where the hall in which the dinner is held is so small that the waitresses can't get in to serve the food, so they have to pass it through the windows. Unfortunately, there's some building working going on, so there is a trench round the hall. So the waitresses have to lean across a trench and pass the food. As a result, the courses get in a bit of a muddle, and you tend to get a clue to what was coming next, because there was a bit of it on the course, like you knew what the pudding was going to be because there'd be a bit of blancmange on the edge of the soup, and you knew what was coming later.
Talking of meals, we, as EMAP newspaper,
for whom you used to work,
yes, John Major expressed a wish to meet some people from EMAP. And we had a lunch with him in Huntingdon, I think. And the lunch was organised by someone in Huntingdon who worked for the company, who knew that Emily Blatch, who was then the Conservatives' education minister.
That's right. Yes, she was a lovely person.
She was a raving Dennis fan.
Oh.
And she came with John Major, and the girl who'd set this up knew that she was a raving Dennis fan, so she introduced me to Emily Blatch as Dennis's wife. Emily Blatch couldn't handle this at all because she thought that Dennis was real. She knew he wasn't, of course, but she preferred to believe that he was real, and it rather spoiled the illusion that I was introduced as Dennis.
Lady Blatch, as she then was, she got
she was
ennobled. She was a smashing person.
Yeah,
it's the range of people that still like Dennis. You will get 8-year-old boys who like him because he's so disgusting, and then you get Addenbrooke's consultants who like him. There was one Addenbrooke's consultant. I can't remember in what speciality, but there was one episode that wasn't available commercially. We hadn't released, and that he absolutely. I think we had to send him a special recording. It was the one where Dennis is explaining that they didn't do a pantomime in the village hall that year. They did a musical. We done a whole musical, Miss South. Oh, really? What was it called? Miss South, that was called Singing on the Drain. And we did a whole musical based on singing in the drain.
Because I know you used to go and give talks on your journalistic life and the troubles in Northern Ireland and so on and so forth at various Cambridge colleges. And I think you told Pete that actually all anyone really wanted to ask about was Dennis.
Yes. Yeah. That's quite right.
Yes.
You'd think that you could be very entertaining about all sorts of things, but no, what they wanted to hear about was Dennis. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it was probably on the tour of Grunty Fen in the bus tours that we used to do.
Oh, yes. Oh, I'd forgotten about this. And even a river trip.
And the river trip. We did river trip especially in the rain, they were very successful. And the rhubarb semaphore.
Rhubarb semaphore, yeah.
And the quizzes that people had to complete. Are you posh?
Oh, yes,
or not
church or chapel.
Yeah.
Yes.
And people used to get very, very irate with each other, couples. But I remember 2 chaps from quite a long way away arrived on the bus tour, and they knew the scripts off by heart. I have a feeling one of them was blind.
And they just played them and played them and played them.
They knew the whole thing.
I'm trying to remember. There was another one where we laughed and laughed, and it was very difficult to record it. It was Dennis had wanted to make a travel a commercial to attract tourists to Grunty Fen. And so that he'd written a script in which we would go round the village and see its many highlights and wonderful places. And one of them was the village shop. So he'd produced this script, and he asked Mr. South, would he mind just trying it out with him? Could you be, Mr. South, could you be the tourist coming round? And Dennis was going to play Miss Edwards in the village shop. So we walk in, and Mr. South says, good morning, and Dennis says, good morning. Can I help you? And Mr. South, the tourist, said, yes. Have you any lightweight folding safari dinner gongs? And Miss Edwards replies, what size? Oh, I'm sorry. I mustn't laugh because it upsets my chest. Oh, I need a rest. I don't know.
He didn't tell you about the occasion that he met my father.
No.
Dennis met my father.
No.
It was, only a few years after Pete had started to do Dennis on stage. And he'd done a gig in Oxford. And my parents at the time lived in a little village called Milton under Wychwood. And we arrived very late, early hours of the morning, and went to bed. And my parents were both up and first thing in the morning. And I said, we do Dennis, because they'd never met Dennis. They'd been told about him and they'd seen photographs. And so he got up, dressed as Dennis, went outside, came up, they had a big garden which my mother looked after, and she kept hens and she had soft fruit and vegetables. He asked my father for some eggs. So my father summoned my mother, said, gentleman here would like some eggs. So my mother went off to get the eggs. And my father was a charming man, interested in everyone. So, well, I haven't met you before. Do you live in the village? Oh, well, I just moved. Oh, whereabouts? Well, that Pete didn't really know the village at all, so he had to be a bit vague. And, oh, said my father, and he looked at his raincoat with all the badges. And that's this is my British Country Music Association badge. My father says, well, that's interesting because we've got Pete Sayers staying here.
Oh, no.
Oh, Dennis said, I'd like to meet him. So father says, well, I'll go and get him. So he came indoors and Elizabeth, now where's Pete? There's a gentleman out here who wants to meet him. I said, well, he's in the bath. And he said, well, go and get him. So I had to go upstairs and have a growly sort of conversation with myself to try and sound like Pete in the bath. And I came downstairs and I said, look, he's very tired. He really doesn't want to meet anybody. Well, that's very, very rude. This man really seems very, very keen to meet him. Go and ask him again. I said, right, but I really don't think I can.
What was the solution? How did you get out of it? You can't be two people at once.
Well, no. My father was, who was the most courteous of men, thought this was extremely rude of Pete. And my mother, who was in the raspberry bushes, I think she reared up and she said, I think perhaps we've had enough of this. And at which point Pete took the hat.
So she realised.
She knew, but my father, who obviously hadn't really been paying attention to when I talked about Dennis, and I think my father didn't speak for the rest of the day. He was so shocked. And I think if he hadn't had a stronger heart, I think he'd have had a heart attack. He had no idea, absolutely no idea at all. And he just couldn't speak.
I've never heard that one before.
Yeah. And that was probably that, and Pete's best friend got married, and they had a lunch after the wedding ceremony, and everybody said, "Oh, bring Dennis," and
bring Dennis.
So coffee was served, and Pete disappeared very quickly. Came back, sat down, and went round talking to the guests. And afterwards, the bride's father said, well, it couldn't possibly have been Pete. He just disappeared. He didn't own up. He just disappeared. And the bride's father said it couldn't possibly have been Pete because he was wearing lace-up shoes and he wouldn't have had time to change into lace-up shoes and all the rest of the gear.
Because he always wore those boots.
He was so quick. They were lace-up shoes.
I can remember his clothing. Radio Cambridgeshire used to do open days when the listeners would come along to the studios, and we'd get a huge numbers, 2,000 or 3,000 people in the course of a day. And Dennis and I were outside building, and Dennis was standing there with his black corduroy hat on, American cloth shopping bag in one hand, Macintosh, cycle clips on his dirty flannel trousers, lace-up boots, buck teeth, pebble glasses. And out of the crowd, there emerged this guy carrying an American cloth bag, pebble glasses, buck teeth, cap, and he walked up to Pete or Dennis and said, "You're a funny-looking old boy, aren't you?" And it was like a mirror image, And the chap the listener, bless his heart, didn't realise that what he looked like himself. "You're a funny-looking old chap, aren't you?" God, jeez. Let me test your knowledge on the subject. Dennis had a motto that he got from a bottle. What was Dennis's lifelong motto that he got from a bottle? If I tell you it was a bottle of Brobat, does that help? It's something that Dennis, all through his life, he said, "I've always believed one thing, Miss South. I got this motto, I got it off a bottle of Brobat. Keep upright in a cool place."
I have it embroidered by Mrs. South.
Oh, did she? Because Mrs. South used to do the tapestries.
Yes, it's a tapestry.
That were based on Granny's embroideries.
Yes.
Because Granny this is Dennis's grandmother, aged 92. There's a story hangs by that. At the beginning, we said she was 92, and then one week we said she was 91. And people complained, how could this happen? And you'd think that we might be stumped to explain how a lady can get younger by a year. But Dennis had the answer. He said, "She lies about her age." What was I saying before we got that? I was going to tell you something else and I lost my thread. Oh, it doesn't matter. You could go on for years about Dennis. I don't regret a moment of it, Not many people have had such nice Tuesday mornings, just writing that and thinking up mad ideas, and some of them were too mad and we had to calm it down a bit. And it got really better in the last 2 years when we suddenly got what we should have had all along, which was somebody who was brave enough to tell us, "You've got that wrong," or "Don't do it that way, do it this way," or no, that doesn't work. And that was Carol Carman. And she was one of the few people in the world who had two things. First of all, she liked Dennis and she understood what we were trying to do, because there was a lot of social commentary in it. You know, we were trying to ridicule pretentious people and fools and so on, and applaud people who were unfortunate and trying hard. And Carol Carman got hold of it, and first of all, as I say, she understood what it was about. But then she had the courage to stand up to us and tell us, that we'd already been doing it for 10 years or more when she had the cheek to tell us how to do it. And we got better then. The last 2 or 3 years, I really think we were on the edge of being quite good. Well, we had to learn the hard way. One of the many mistakes we made, it was so naive. We believed that the best way to get accurate sound effects when you were in some unusual situation was to go to that situation. So when we had a whole episode about the exploding spam, you know, the 1945 spam, that it's in a critical condition because the tins burst if they're disturbed, and they're stored in an old concrete pillbox out on the fen. And we wanted to record inside the pillbox with the exploding spam. So we pre-recorded the spam explosions from a sound effects record and put them on tape and took a sort of ghetto blaster in. And then we went to a concrete pillbox and we then recorded inside the pillbox to make authentic sound. Complete nonsense. You'd have done better in a studio. We did a recording supposedly in the crypt of Ely Cathedral. As you know, it hasn't got a crypt, but nevertheless, how can we get the sound effects of a crypt? So we went to the wine cellar of a shop in Church Street, Saffron Walden. An antique shop, Reed's, and they got a beautiful old brick-arched wine cellar under the ground there. And we recorded in there. Completely unnecessary. We wanted to record inside a workshop. So Irene Cranwell allowed us to record in the workshop of her late husband, who had been a wheelwright. Completely unnecessary. All the hours we spent on sound effects. And we'd have done better to use just the studio and get away with it. You know, it's often the fake sound effect is much more convincing than the real thing. I know that sounds a bit cockeyed, but it's true. It's lovely to talk about it, Liz. And you've put me right on a whole bit of my life, which I was involved in, but never really quite understood the detail. And that first meeting in the Memorial Hall at Newmarket.
And then and the fact that obviously Pete saw something in you that made him think
he knew I could keep a straight face. Yeah. And also always be earnest. Mr. South had to be earnestly endeavouring to make sense of all this.
But although you say that you sussed him more or less straight away, I think he prefers to believe that you ran with it. You didn't suss him for quite some time.
No, well, I don't know. I mean, I can't remember. But my feeling was that I thought there was something very strange after a little while. Yeah, but I'm not prepared to say what that little while is. I thought it was about 30 seconds. He thinks it's about 30 minutes. Well, he would, wouldn't he? Yes. I mean, each of us is trying to preserve his own reputation in that. I wouldn't want to be thought a fool. Liz, it's been lovely.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Happy memories.
Happy memories indeed there from Liz Sayers, and we'd like to thank Liz for taking the time to share them with us. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and please do have a look round our website, dennisofgruntyfen.co.uk. There you can find more information on Grunty Fen and its characters, and also you could pop into our online shop for books, recordings, downloads and memorabilia. On behalf of Mr. South, Miss Edwards and all at Grunty Fennery, we'd like to wish you all the very best of the festive season. We'll be back next year, so take care and keep upright in a cool place.